The storm had been building all afternoon, turning the Montana sky the color of old pewter and sending the cattle to huddle against the barn walls. Jacob Hayes stood at his kitchen window, watching the lightning dance across the horizon and listening to thunder roll down from the mountains like an avalanche of sound. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 8 years, ever since Margaret died in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her. 8 years of solitude, of speaking only to his animals and the occasional supply merchant, of avoiding the pitying looks and well-meaning advice of the townspeople, who thought a man his age should have married again by now. At 35, Jacob had learned to find peace in isolation. The ranch ran smoothly under his sole management, his cattle were healthy, and his small cabin was exactly as organized as he needed it to be. No complications, no emotional entanglements, no risk of the kind of devastating loss that had nearly destroyed him when Margaret died. The first crack of thunder shook the windows, and Jacob turned away from the storm to check his supplies. The weather looked like it would be severe, possibly lasting through the night. He had enough food and firewood to last a week if necessary, and his animals were secure. Whatever the storm brought, he was prepared to weather it alone, as he weathered everything else. That's when he heard the sound that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude forever. It was barely audible over the wind and thunder, a soft thump against his front door, followed by what might have been a moan of pain or exhaustion. Jacob froze, listening intently. Wild animals sometimes sought shelter during storms, but this sound was different, more desperate, more human. Another thump, weaker this time, and then a voice definitely human, definitely female, and carrying the edge of panic that comes with real distress. "Please, someone, help me." Jacob grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and moved cautiously toward the door. Living alone in the wilderness meant being prepared for anything, from desperate outlaws to displaced Indians to travelers who'd lost their way and their minds in the vast emptiness of the territory. He'd learned not to trust easily, but when he opened the door, rifle ready, what he found made him forget every careful lesson about self-preservation he'd ever learned. A young woman lay collapsed on his porch, her dress soaked through with rain and mud, her dark hair plastered to her skull. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of genteel upbringing despite her current bedraggled state. But it was her condition that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. She was heavily pregnant, 8 months along, if he had to guess, and clearly in distress. Her breathing was labored, her face pale except for 2 bright spots of fever on her cheeks, and her hands clutched protectively at her swollen belly. "Ma'am," Jacob said, setting his rifle aside and kneeling beside her. "Mum, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, green eyes, he noticed, the color of spring grass, and fixed on his face with desperate relief. "Thank God," she whispered. I was afraid no one would find me. What happened to you? Where did you come from?" "My husband," she began, then stopped, her face crumpling with pain that seemed to be emotional as much as physical. "He's dead, killed 3 days ago by road agents. They took everything, our wagon, our money, our supplies. I've been walking ever since." Jacob felt his heart clench with sympathy. Road agents were the scourge of the frontier, bandits who preyed on travelers foolish or desperate enough to venture into the wilderness without adequate protection. For this young woman to have escaped them at all was miraculous. For her to have survived 3 days alone in her condition was nothing short of extraordinary. "We need to get you inside," he said, slipping his arms under her carefully. "You're burning with fever, and this storm's only going to get worse." She was lighter than he'd expected, despite her pregnancy, suggesting she hadn't been eating well even before her ordeal began. As he carried her inside, she whispered, "I'm sorry to impose. I know men don't. I understand if you can't, Mum." Jacob interrupted gently, setting her down on his bed, the only comfortable place to rest in his small cabin. "Right now you're a human being in distress, and I'm a human being with shelter and supplies. Nothing else matters." As he lit additional lamps to examine her condition more clearly, Jacob found himself remembering skills he'd thought he'd buried with Margaret. During their brief marriage, he'd helped her through 2 difficult pregnancies that had ended in miscarriage before the final, fatal one, he'd learned about women's needs during such times, about the signs of labor, about the delicate balance between life and death that hung over every birth in the wilderness. This woman was in bad shape, but she was strong. He could see it in the set of her jaw, in the way she tried to control her breathing despite obvious pain, in the protective way she held her unborn child even in her extremity. "What's your name?" he asked as he brought her water and began cleaning the worst of the mud from her face and hands. "Catherine," she said. "Catherine Morrison. My husband was Daniel. We were traveling to his brother's ranch in Oregon when she trailed off, unable or unwilling to relive the attack. I'm Jacob Hayes. This is my ranch, and you're safe here. Mr. Hayes, I need you to know I think the baby's coming. I've been having pains since yesterday, but they're getting stronger, closer together." Jacob felt a familiar stab of panic, the same terror that had gripped him during Margaret's final labor. But he pushed it down, focusing on the immediate needs of the woman before him. "How far apart are the pains?" "Maybe 10 minutes, sometimes less." Jacob nodded, trying to project calm confidence. He didn't feel. "Then we have time to get you cleaned up and comfortable. Have you eaten anything in the past day?" "Some berries I found yesterday morning. I was afraid to stop for long, afraid they'd catch up with me. They won't find you here," Jacob said firmly. "This ranch is well off the main trails, and in this storm, even if they were still pursuing you, they'd have to take shelter somewhere." As he prepared broth and gathered clean linens, Jacob found himself studying Catherine Morrison with growing admiration. She'd survived an attack that killed her husband, escaped on foot while heavily pregnant, and walked for 3 days through wilderness that defeated grown men in perfect health. She was either the luckiest woman alive or the strongest, and he was beginning to suspect it was the latter. "Mr. Hayes," Catherine said as he helped her sip the warm broth, "I need to ask something of you. If something happens to me during the birth, will you promise to take care of my baby? I know it's a lot to ask of a stranger, but nothing's going to happen to you," Jacob interrupted, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "You've come too far and fought too hard to give up now. But if it does, then yes," he said quietly. "I promise, but it won't come to that." Outside, the storm reached its full fury, lashing the cabin with rain and hail while thunder shook the very foundations. But inside, in the warm glow of lamplight, two strangers began the delicate process of bringing new life into a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. Jacob had thought his days of caring for anyone other than himself were over. He'd built his solitude like a fortress, protecting himself from the possibility of loss by refusing to let anyone close enough to matter. But as he watched Catherine Morrison fight for the life of her unborn child with a courage that humbled him, Jacob realized that some battles chose you, whether you wanted them or not, and some people entered your life with such force that all your carefully constructed walls came tumbling down in an instant. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something else was building, something that would change both their lives forever. The contractions came harder as the night deepened, and Jacob found himself drawing on memories he'd tried for 8 years to forget. Margaret's labors had taught him more about childbirth than most frontier men ever learned, knowledge gained through love and terror in equal measure. Now, as Catherine gripped his hand through another wave of pain, that painful education might be the difference between life and death. "Breathe through it," he coached, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Don't fight the pain, work with it." Catherine nodded, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool night air. She'd proven to be remarkably strong throughout the long hours of labor, never complaining, never losing the determined set to her jaw that had carried her through 3 days of wilderness survival. "Tell me about your husband," Jacob said during a brief respite between contractions, hoping to keep her mind occupied. "What was he like?" Catherine's eyes softened with memory. "Daniel was. He was good, kind. He saw the best in everyone, sometimes to his own detriment." Her hand moved protectively over her belly. "He was so excited about the baby. He'd talk to it every night, tell it stories about the life we'd have in Oregon." "What kind of stories?" "About the farm we'd build, the animals we'd raise. He wanted to teach the baby to ride, to read, to see the beauty in simple things." tears mixed with sweat on her cheeks. He said a child raised with love and purpose could become anything. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. He sounds like he would have been a good father, the best. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and Catherine gripped Jacob's hand with surprising strength. When it passed, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through, to his soul. "What about you? Have you ever been married?" Jacob hesitated, then decided honesty was what she deserved. "Yes. My wife Margaret died 8 years ago, in childbirth." Understanding flickered in Catherine's eyes, followed by something that might have been concern. "I'm sorry. This must be difficult for you." "I'm not going to let what happened to Margaret happen to you," Jacob said fiercely. "I've learned things since then, read medical books, studied what went wrong. You're different, stronger, healthier, and you're going to survive this." As if in response to his words, Catherine suddenly tensed, her eyes going wide. "Something's changed. The pain is different." Jacob moved to examine her, his face growing serious. "The baby's coming. I can see the head." What followed was the most intense hour of Jacob's life since Margaret's death. Catherine labored with a determination that awed him, never giving up despite exhaustion that would have felled most people. Jacob found himself coaching, encouraging, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in 8 years ago. "I can see more of the head," he reported. "Dark hair, like yours." One more push and Catherine bore down with everything she had. And suddenly the baby's head emerged, followed quickly by tiny shoulders and the rest of the small body. Jacob caught the child with hands that trembled with adrenaline and wonder, quickly checking for breathing, for signs of life. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then the baby drew breath and released a cry that filled the cabin with the sound of life triumphant. "It's a girl," Jacob announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Catherine collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. "Is she really all right?" "She's perfect." Jacob cleaned the baby carefully, wrapped her in the softest blanket he could find, and placed her in Catherine's arms. "Look at her." Catherine gazed down at her daughter with an expression of such pure love that Jacob had to look away, overwhelmed by memories of holding his own lost child, by the might-have-beens that haunted his dreams. "Hello, little one," Catherine whispered. "I'm your mama, and this is Mr. Hayes, who helped bring you into the world." The baby quieted at her mother's voice, dark eyes trying to focus on the face above her. She was beautiful, delicate features that echoed her mother's, but with a determined set to her tiny jaw that suggested she'd inherited Catherine's strength. "What will you name her?" Jacob asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope Morrison." "Hope," Jacob repeated, and found that he liked the sound of it. "It suits her." As dawn approached, and the storm finally began to subside, Jacob attended to the necessary tasks, ensuring Catherine was comfortable, helping her with the baby's first feeding, cleaning up the evidence of the night's drama. But through it all, he was acutely aware of a fundamental shift in his world. His carefully ordered, solitary existence had been invaded by new life, by the needs of a mother and child who had nowhere else to go. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to help them reach the nearest town as soon as Catherine was strong enough to travel, to return to his isolation before he became too attached, before their inevitable departure could devastate him the way Margaret's death had. But as he watched Catherine cuddle her daughter, as he saw Hope's tiny fingers wrap around Catherine's thumb with surprising strength, Jacob found himself reluctant to start planning their departure. "Mr. Hayes," Catherine said softly, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done. You saved both our lives. You did the hard work." Jacob replied, "I just provided a safe place for it to happen." "It was more than that, and you know it." Catherine's green eyes were serious, searching. "You could have turned us away, could have decided it was too much risk, too much trouble. But you didn't." Jacob was quiet, not sure how to respond to gratitude that felt undeserved. He'd simply done what any decent person would do, hadn't he? "Where will you go?" he asked finally. "When you're ready to travel?" Catherine's face clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know. Daniel's brother in Oregon, I've never met him. Don't even know if he'd welcome a widow with a child. My own family disowned Me when I married Daniel. They thought he was beneath our station." She laughed bitterly. "Funny how wrong they were about what really matters. You have money, supplies, nothing. The road agents took everything of value." Catherine looked down at Hope, her expression fierce with protective love. "But I'll find a way. I have to." Jacob found himself studying this remarkable woman who'd survived tragedy that would have broken most people, who'd endured labor and childbirth with courage that humbled him, who faced an uncertain future with nothing but her newborn daughter and her own determination. "There's no rush," he heard himself saying. "You need time to recover, and the baby needs to get stronger before traveling. You're welcome to stay here as long as necessary." Catherine's eyes widened with surprise and relief. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. This ranch is plenty big enough for 3 people. Even as he said it, Jacob realized the significance of his words. 3 people. When had he started thinking of them as a unit, a family? When had the idea of their departure started to feel less like relief and more like impending loss? As if sensing the shift in the adult's relationship, baby Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at Jacob. Her gaze was unfocused but intent, as if she were trying to memorize his face. Without thinking, Jacob reached out and gently touched her tiny hand. Hope's fingers immediately closed around his index finger with surprising strength, and Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years: the overwhelming, terrifying, wonderful sensation of being needed by someone small and helpless and precious. "She likes you," Catherine observed with a smile. "She's probably just hungry," Jacob said. But he made no move to extract his finger from the baby's grip. Outside, the sun was rising on a world washed clean by the storm. Inside the cabin, 3 people who had been strangers 12 hours ago were beginning the delicate process of becoming something more: a family forged not by blood, but by circumstance, necessity, and the strange alchemy that sometimes occurs when broken hearts find each other in the darkness. Jacob Hayes had spent 8 years learning to live without love, without hope, without the possibility of loss. But as he looked at Catherine Morrison and her newborn daughter, he began to wonder if maybe it was time to learn how to live with those things again. After all, some storms brought destruction, but others brought new life, washing away the old, to make room for something better, something stronger, something worth the risk of caring again. 3 weeks after Hope's birth, Jacob's carefully ordered world had been turned completely upside down, and he was surprised to discover he didn't mind at all. The cabin that had echoed with lonely silence for 8 years now hummed with the sounds of life: Catherine's gentle humming as she worked, Hope's cries that somehow managed to be demanding and endearing at the same time, and conversations that reminded Jacob what it was like to share his thoughts with another human being. Catherine had recovered quickly from the birth, displaying the same remarkable strength that had carried her through wilderness and childbirth. She'd insisted on contributing to the household from the moment she could stand, cooking meals that were far better than anything Jacob had managed for himself, mending clothes that had gone too long without proper care, and bringing a woman's touch to a space that had been purely functional for too long. But it was Hope who had truly transformed the place. At 3 weeks old, she was alert and healthy, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and her mother's green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with serious consideration. She had also, to Jacob's amazement, seemed to accept him as a permanent fixture in her small world, calming when he held her and even sleeping peacefully in his arms. "She trusts you," Catherine observed one evening as they sat by the fire. Hope nestled contentedly against Jacob's chest while Catherine mended one of his shirts. "Babies are good judges of character, or she just likes being warm," Jacob replied, but his voice was soft with affection as he looked down at the sleeping infant. "No, it's more than that. She knows you're safe, that you care about her." Jacob was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been weighing on his mind for days. "Catherine, what are your plans? I mean, long term. You can't stay here forever." Catherine's hands stilled on the mending, and Jacob saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "I've been thinking about that. I could try to reach Daniel's brother in Oregon, but..." She trailed off, clearly struggling with something. "But but I don't know anything about him except his name and approximate location. He might not want the burden of a widowed sister-in-law and her child. He might not even be alive. Daniel hadn't heard from him in over a year when we started our journey. Jacob felt his chest tighten at the thought of Catherine and Hope facing such uncertainty alone. What about going back east? Surely your family would take me back if I came crawling home, abandoned and penniless, as proof that they were right about Daniel. Catherine's laugh was bitter. They might, but they'd make me pay for defying them for the rest of my life. And Hope. She looked at her sleeping daughter with fierce protectiveness. I won't have her raised to believe that love is a luxury only the wealthy can afford, or that her father was somehow lesser because he worked with his hands instead of inheriting his money. So what will you do? Catherine was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been thinking, maybe I could find work in one of the territorial towns as a seamstress or a cook or even a teacher if anyone would hire a woman without references. It wouldn't be easy, especially with Hope, but we could manage. The idea of Catherine struggling alone in some rough frontier town, trying to make a living, while caring for an infant, made Jacob's stomach clench with worry. He'd seen what happened to women without protection or resources in such places. The lucky ones found honest work and decent boarding houses. The unlucky ones, well, their stories didn't bear thinking about. That's a hard life for a woman alone. He said carefully, hard, yes, but honest, and Hope would be with me. Jacob looked down at the baby in his arms, at her peaceful face and tiny, trusting hands, and felt something shift definitively in his heart. He'd spent 3 weeks watching Catherine care for her daughter with a love so fierce and pure it took his breath away. He'd spent 3 weeks falling in love with a child who wasn't his, who had no claim on his affection except for the simple fact that she existed and needed protection. And he'd spent 3 weeks rediscovering what it meant to care about someone else's happiness more than his own comfort. Catherine, he said, his voice rougher than he intended, what if you didn't have to leave? She looked up sharply from her mending. What do you mean? Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them, one way or another. I mean, what if you stayed here, permanently, as my wife? The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Catherine stared at him with an expression Jacob couldn't read, and he began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Jacob, she said finally, you don't have to do that. You don't owe us anything more than you've already given. This isn't about obligation. Jacob said firmly, this is about the fact that for the first time in 8 years, I don't dread getting up in the morning. It's about how this house feels like a home instead of just a place to exist. It's about Hope, and how much I already love her, and how the thought of watching you both leave feels like it might kill me. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Jacob, I care about you too, more than I should after such a short time. But you need to understand I loved Daniel deeply. I may never be able to love another man the way I loved him. I'm not asking you to forget Daniel or stop loving him, Jacob said gently. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the heart has room for more than one kind of love. I'm asking you to stay because we work well together, because Hope needs a father and I need a family, and because sometimes the best marriages are built on friendship and respect and shared purpose, rather than just passion. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression thoughtful. You really want this, even knowing that I might never love you the way you deserve. Catherine, in the 3 weeks you've been here, you've brought more joy into my life than I've had in 8 years. If that's all I ever get, it's more than I ever hoped for. Hope stirred in Jacob's arms, making the small mewing sounds that meant she was waking up. Catherine reached for her daughter, and as Jacob handed the baby over, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but Jacob felt warmth spread through him at the simple touch. Can I think about it? Catherine asked. Of course, take all the time you need. But even as he said it, Jacob could see the answer in Catherine's eyes, in the way she looked around the cabin that had become home to her and her daughter, in the soft smile that touched her lips as she watched him with hope. 2 days later, Catherine gave him her answer, and it was yes. They were married the following week in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. who happened to be passing through the county. Catherine wore the one good dress she'd managed to salvage from her ordeal, and Jacob wore his best shirt and pants, freshly washed and mended by his bride-to-be's skilled hands. The only witnesses were the preacher, a neighboring rancher who'd become a friend over the years, and baby Hope, who slept peacefully through the entire ceremony in Catherine's arms. Do you, Jacob Hayes, take Catherine Morrison to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Jacob said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. And do you, Catherine Morrison, take Jacob Hayes to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Catherine looked into Jacob's eyes, and he saw not passionate love, but something deeper and perhaps more lasting: trust, gratitude, affection, and the promise of whatever might grow between them in the years to come. I do, she said quietly. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Jacob kissed Catherine's cheek gently, formally, and she smiled at him with warmth that made his heart race. It wasn't the passionate beginning he'd had with Margaret, but it was a beginning nonetheless, full of possibility and hope. That night, as they settled into their new roles as husband and wife, Catherine nursing Hope while Jacob banked the fire, she said, "Jacob, I need you to know something." "What's that?" "When I chose Hope's name, I thought it was for her hope for her future, hope that she'd have a good life despite everything that had happened. But now I think maybe it was for all of us. She brought Hope back into your life, just like you, and she brought Hope back into mine." Jacob looked at his new wife and daughter because Hope was his daughter now, in every way that mattered, and felt a contentment he'd thought was lost to him forever. "Maybe that's what hope is," he said. "Not just believing that things will get better, but being willing to work to make them better." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of spring still weeks away. But inside the cabin, winter had already given way to something warmer, something that had taken root in the most unlikely circumstances and grown into something beautiful. Jacob Hayes had spent 8 years learning to live without hope, but on a stormy night when a pregnant stranger collapsed on his porch, hope had found him anyway, disguised as someone else's desperate need and his own reluctant compassion. And now, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have, Jacob understood that sometimes the best gifts are the ones we never see coming, the ones that arrive in the middle of our darkest storms and change everything simply by existing. Hope Morrison Hayes, for that was her name, now stirred in her mother's arms and opened her dark eyes, looking around the cabin that was her first real home. And if babies could understand such things, she might have known that she was surrounded by love, protected by promises, and blessed with parents who would move heaven and earth to give her the kind of life her father Daniel had dreamed of, a life built on love, purpose, and the unshakable belief that every storm eventually passes, leaving room for new growth in its wake. Thank you for following Jacob and Catherine's extraordinary journey, from strangers thrown together by storm to a family built on hope, compassion, and the courage to love again. This powerful story reminds us that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as emergencies, and that opening our hearts to those in need often heals us as much as it helps them. If this tale of unexpected family, second chances, and the transformative power of caring moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about love, hope, and the beautiful ways broken hearts can heal each other. Your support helps us continue sharing these vital messages about the strength we find in community and compassion. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are many more heartwarming adventures waiting for you.